this model is that entomologists, maybe unlike botanists, we're not very good collaborators, as it turns out. Botanists have a history of always working together. They produce florists. But entomologists don't have a history of creating these books, this Entomofauna of Madagascar series, for example. It's just not part of what we do. So we ship insects to taxonomists, and the years go by, 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, and we don't really have much in terms of taking back to Madagascar to say, this is the solution to where we should preserve insects, or these are the biodiversity patterns in Madagascar. And that's really a challenge that I wanted to think about and address. And as an ant researcher, I felt I needed to figure out how to do it first with ants. So I just want to take a break here and tell you how I've been addressing this problem with ants. And I think it's part of a problem of how underfunded entomology has been. Like, so few people with such a vast project, insects, but also a history of how we can actually capitalize on new technology and how we can make a team. And that's the challenge. How do you make entomologists feel they're part of a team? So we began by training the next generation. We started this program of teaching a course in Madagascar of entomology, specifically these groups that we decided upon. One is the ants. And I taught the course in Madagascar, and I started teaching this international course called Ant Course that travels the world, and we teach 30 to 35 students around the world. For the last 16 years, we've taught this course from Borneo to Peru to Uganda, all over the world, in fact. It's a fabulous experience, trying to train them. And we realized that we had to somehow put online all this knowledge we have about entomology. To identify an ant in Madagascar, nobody in Madagascar could do it, because nobody would have the funds to travel and find all the types to compare. In fact, we don't even know where the types are. We don't have access to the literature. We don't have access to even the keys. So to actually democratize this, we started this project called AntWeb. And that is basically turning a museum into a virtual museum, but also trying to develop tools to curate it, and by emphasizing types. So if you haven't had a chance, check out AntWeb, and this is where all the images we take here will show up. And our goal is to have an image of every species, including the image of the type of that species. So we've imaged 50,000 specimens so far, over 200,000 images are on AntWeb. We have a database of specimens of over 600,000, but it's growing. And we estimate we'll image 700 specimens here, so that'll be an important contribution. In a sense, the Kiev ant collection will be online when our project is finished. Now, imaging technology has advanced. We started this project in 2001 in San Francisco, where we held a competition with industry and microscope companies to actually develop a software to actually image ants. So this is what you saw in a microscope, but using technology where we would image, as you've seen, stacks of images, you would slowly get into a focused image. We first started working with a company called Automontage. Then they were incorporated into Leica system. Then with Leica we designed lighting systems, and now you can buy a complete system in Leica. This is Prenopelta from Madagascar. I think it's Seychellensis. So this technology has really allowed us to kind of compete with birds, right? So now, or pictures of cats on the internet. You know, everybody loves pictures of cats. Well, now we can look at ant pictures instead. And sister to the museum, we needed a catalog. So we started what's called Ant Cat. And this is where we manage names. We have all the catalog of ants, building on the work of Barry Bolton and others. We've had all the literature all of it scanned in, and we have access to the original PDFs. We have access to the up-to-date. It's done by a community. The taxonomists log on and keep it updated. So we use this as a name management system behind AntWeb. So when people upload specimen data or museum data, we update it to the current valid names when it's updated, or alert you when you haven't got the correct name, and we check all these things. So that's how we maintain a vetted system for ants online. And this is just the taxonomic infrastructure that's needed to allow somebody in Madagascar to enter the field of taxonomy. And this is really the goal, and that also means when I'm in San Francisco, I can access the collection here in the sense of the types. I can't stress how important this is. Oh, this was a mistake. This is just a recent a book that also kind of democratizes or competes with bird books. We have our first of a series of books on the ant genera of biogeographic regions, and this is the one on Africa and Madagascar. And there's a copy upstairs if you want to look at it with Dr. Machenko. And in Madagascar, we have been making progress with a team, and this is the species that Flavia described, Stigmatoma rahodi. There's 420 species we've described of ants alone in Madagascar since 2000. That's not bad, but still, that's less than half the species described. At the current rate, it'll still take us another 15 years to describe all the ant species in Madagascar. And we've given nothing in terms of contribution. We kept saying, we'll describe species and then we'll do conservation in Madagascar. But at this rate, I'm beginning to wonder what forest will be left in 15 years. So we have to find a new strategy. And I'll talk about that in a moment. But we do have lots of great data. We write papers about diversity patterns, where's the most species-rich habitat. Of course, you may have guessed what it's humid forest is the most diverse habitat. This is comparing arboreal and ground nesting species. We have about 95% of the species are endemic to Madagascar. And I said we estimate about 1,200 species are there. When I first got to Madagascar, there was less than 300 species described. So there's been a great augmentation in species. If you look at patterns of diversity across the island, this is just all the data combined. You see that there's a peak of diversity at about 450 to 600 meters in elevation, which is interesting. Not sure why that's happening. A lot of hypotheses about patterns of diversity. But this is a rich, unique world where we have complete coverage of all species across all habitats. You can really mine it for really interesting data on ecology and biodiversity patterns, the evolution of species turnover. And our current project, funded by the National Science Foundation, is to sequence each species using next-gen sequencing called UCE, ultra-conserved elements, and we'll get 2,500 loci for each species, and we'll use it to look at patterns of phylogenetic diversity across habitat, across community phylogenetics patterns, and it's very exciting to do that. But still, this kind of academic approach does not have any direct relevance to actually how do we stop the destruction in Madagascar. This is just some of the examples we have of using community phylogenetics to look at community structure in a phylogenetic context across habitat and strata, from canopy to lowland. So this is kind of the current project we're working on. When you go to Madagascar, you are first surprised not by its diversity and bizarre animals, because all you see is this. When you're driving through Madagascar, you just see destruction. And then you go into this forest. It's like walking through a curtain into this wonderful world. And you live in it, you're doing research, and then you come out, and you see this again. And you're so saddened by what's happening, and you see it, that this is just a patch of forest. We must be able to do something. And I wanted to start thinking about, is there something we can do? My initial idea of waiting until I've described species, to all my 180 collaborating taxonomists have done something, that we would have a solution or understanding of priorities for Madagascar. We have made great contributions to science, but I feel that we have not made great contributions to Madagascar in terms of preserving that forest. So the big question is, we see forest now, but in 50 years, how much forest will be left? I can't imagine any forest will be left in 50 years in Madagascar if we don't do something different. Who's saving the forest? Well, it's not entomologists. And I ask myself, why are we sitting on the sidelines? In the southwest of Madagascar right now, there's an incredible 5-year famine. And this large flowing river is the only river that has any water at all in it. And we spent last year, or the year before, working there, and it's a shame. We're down there like extracting ants for our pleasure of academics rather than actually thinking about what we can do down there. And it's actually really important, right? You know, Madagascar's population doubled in the last 25 years since I've been working there. It will double in the next 30 years. And what's the problem? You know, we're going to have more people. But who's going to feed that people? Well, that is happening right now in Madagascar. So what are they going to actually do? You cannot tell people who are hungry to stop cutting down the forest, because if they cut down the forest, they can grow something for 3 years. Yes, in 3 years they have to go and cut down more forest. But how can you tell them to stop? So the real issue is you have to start working with people. And that's the challenge. But I think we can do something different as a team if we start to work together. So right now in Madagascar, we've kind of haphazardly chose groups to work on. We chose whatever you're interested in, do a little bit of work, do a little butterfly work, do a little dragonfly work, but nobody's completed the picture for any group at all. So we decided, well, let's start working differently as entomologists. So I formed a group last year called Insects and People of Madagascar. And I wanted to ask those 180 taxonomists, do you want to actually work differently in Madagascar? Who wants to actually not just do some of butterflies or some of the Odonata, but actually do a comprehensive picture of diversity of Madagascar? In other words, work together, let's complete something as entomologists so that we can have an understanding of patterns of diversity. So we formed a group, and now we are using that group of entomologists to design key biodiversity areas for Madagascar. We're using this specified groups for mining companies, for developing mining tools, for monitoring, restoration, and looking at invasive species. So this type group is just starting, but we actually are a very enthusiastic group. So we actually are focusing not on conservation, but on tools to understand the problem. What is the biodiversity patterns? At the same time, we have funding from the EU to actually start databasing the collections in Madagascar, which I think is important for this tool development. And we teamed up with 5 other African museums, and we're databasing their entomology collection there too, as part of this EU-funded Atlas project. And we are publishing kind of popular books on this amazing insects of Madagascar. Tourists go to the forest, and you're only lucky to see a lemur, but you'll always see insects, and they should be more prominent. I mean, the most common boring insect along the side of the road is the giraffe weevil. It's like so beautiful, right? And it's everywhere, but nobody stops to look at it, but they should. It has this amazing behavior of rolling up the leaf and guarding it, and it's amazing stories. So here's developing this idea of insect tourism. But also, we have to figure out a way to deal with this, what I call breakfast before conservation. And it took me a while to realize that the solution did involve insects. And I don't know why I didn't see it before, but in the markets across Madagascar, I've seen this. In fact, even just next to our center, one of the largest markets in the capital sells insects to eat, but I just ignored that. I didn't think it was exciting. But I realized that Madagascar has an incredible history of eating insects. In fact, the early literature pointed out that an amazing observation that Madagascar was the only country they visited where nobody was hungry. Because the travelers between 1880 and 1930 commented that they would even stop conflicts between villages. They would stop the war if there was a locust outbreak nearby. Because they would gather up all the locusts, dry them, or boil them, then dry them, then pound them into a powder. And they would add that powder during the year where they didn't have crops. And insect was a major component. But as the culture changes, they started spraying the locusts so they couldn't eat them, that they lost this in the capitals, in the larger cities. But it still was there. And I just wanted to take a side point that I should have thought of this earlier because it was in the back of my mind. I had this idea of doing a big ant exhibit in San Francisco. And a few years ago I used a vacuum cleaner and sucked up an army ant colony. I brought out 250,000 live ants to San Francisco, and we had them on display at the museum for 1 year. They ran around, we had to feed them. And I was worried about trying to feed them. They eat a lot. So I called up a cricket farm and I said, hey, I need to buy crickets every day. I need crickets. 1 day without crickets and it's dead, the colony. And I said, I want to order 25,000 crickets a day. And they said, no problem. And I said, what? No problem? I said, yeah, that's a small order. I mean, that's a small order? Who is ordering crickets? They said, fish farms, pet companies. And I said, that's a small, I said, who is rearing all these crickets? But I didn't realize at that point, that was what's going to happen is you can rear insects, commercial scale, for feeding. And that was before this famous book came out about entomophagy. This is before the EU started forcing companies to buy insect protein. And this is before I met Darren, who was a cricket farmer, selling for the pet trade. And he too figured out that he could commercialize by using new technology, what he called, this is called the cricket condo. And this is